A common argument against creationism is that our bodies are poorly designed.
Just the opposite is the case. And so today we're going to be looking at things like the human eye. There's a common claim that it's wired backwards and doesn't function effectively. That's not true. Same with the claim about a nerve in our throats that supposedly showcases the lack of intelligent design. And then we'll look at a whole nother category of body parts that they claim are useless. Are these just useless body parts left over from our evolutionary history? Not at all. We're going to debunk those claims and show that we have every reason to put our confidence in intelligent design.
How about our tailbone? Isn't that just a remnant of our evolutionary past? A common argument against creationism is that our bodies are poorly designed. Our eyes, for example. Keaton, you have over a decade experience speaking and writing for Ministries International. And so I'd love for you to address and debunk some of these myths.
Yeah, and they are myths, I would say. This common claim that no designer would create our bodies with these features because they don't work very well. Just the opposite is the case. And so today we're going to be looking at things like the human eye that you mentioned. There's a common claim that it's wired backwards and doesn't function effectively. That's not true. Same with the claim about a nerve in our throats. The recurrent laryngeal nerve supposedly showcases the lack of intelligent design. And then we'll look at a whole nother category of body parts that they claim are useless. Things like the extra bones in our wrists and our ankles. Or ones that people might have heard of like the human appendix or the human tailbone. Are these just useless body parts left over from our evolutionary history? Not at all. We're going to debunk those claims and show that we have every reason to put our confidence in intelligent design. It's the truth of the Bible that comes through in spades when we look at the world of living things. They exhibit marvelous design that implicates the hand of a creator.
It seems as though these critics are just focusing on maybe a few obscure parts of our bodies that seem superficially to be poorly designed, but overall, our bodies are wonderfully made. They're just amazing creations.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. And many atheists would even admit that. I'm thinking here of people like Richard Dawkins, for example, maybe the world's leading atheist today. He wrote a book years ago called The Blind Watchmaker, where he was arguing that you don't need a designer to account for the apparent design in nature. But notice he admits there is apparent design in nature. In fact, on page 1 of that book, he defines biology as the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose.
Okay, so he acquiesces to that point.
Yeah, at least he admits at first blush the world looks designed. So the question is it genuine design? Does the apparent design in nature imply that there's a designer? Or is it an illusion? Is evolution a substitute designer? And this kind of shows how the whole case for evolution, and Darwin himself understood it this way, it was not just a claim about organisms being related to each other. It was an attack on the idea of intelligent design in nature. And, the Bible also would indicate that we're correct about this intuition that we all have, even young children raised in atheist homes. Social science studies have indicated that those children come to believe in God naturally. How? From looking at the things that have been made. And that's what we read in Romans chapter 1, for example, that how do we know God is real? Well, it's from the creation, from the things that God made. It points to his divine features, his power, his eternal divine nature and so forth. So I think that conclusion is exactly right. There are so many features of our bodies that implicate masterful design. Engineers envy nature, and try to imitate it in their own work. And so that conclusion is really the right one.
All right. So this idea of our bodies having these poorly designed features, is this a new idea?
I'm not sure exactly how far back this goes in history, but it does go at least as far back as Charles Darwin himself. For example, in a letter that he wrote to a friend, personal correspondence, even before his famous book, The Origin of Species, was released, he said, man, you look around at nature, and even though much of the church wants to give credit to God as the designer, he said, what an impressive book a devil's chaplain could write about the clumsy, wasteful, blundering low, and horribly cruel works of nature. So what he means by that is that there's all kinds of features in living things that seem to be clumsy designs, not ingenious designs. And a devil's chaplain is sort of a cute way of saying, like if there was a pastor that worked for the devil instead of God, he could write a book, and he has got lots of examples to choose from about deficiencies, poor designs, unintelligent design in nature.
We'll get back to the conversation in just a second. But first, thanks so much for tuning in. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. It genuinely helps us keep producing the talk show. Now, back to the interview.
You alluded to Romans 1 and how so much of what we see in nature reveals the fact that God is the creator. So speaking of what we see, if it's contingent upon what we see, let's go ahead and go back and talk about the eye. You mentioned that early on.
Well, yeah, this claim is one that people like Richard Dawkins makes, or Nathan Lentz, who wrote an entire book called Human Errors. And they say that the vertebrate eye, which includes the eye of human beings, that it's wired backwardly. And the reason is our eyes have the retina at the back, so the light has to pass through the front and go to the retina. But the photoreceptive cells, like the rods and cones in our retinas, you'd expect them to be facing the light, but actually they're turned around the opposite way. And they've got nerves coming out the back, which are almost like wires that the light has to pass through. And so they say this is going to distort the light. A second problem, they say, is that because those nerves, the wiring is inside the eye, somehow it has to exit to get to the brain. And so it actually passes through a hole in the back of the eye. They're all sort of like clumped together, and then they exit the back of the eye where that causes a blind spot in our eyes. And so we can't see in that part of our visual field. There's actually a blind spot in the human eye. And so they say, basically the reason our eyes are like this is because evolution has no goal or foresight. It just worked with this, bad system that happened to come about. Whereas if an intelligent designer had made our eyes from scratch, he would not do it this way.
It's easy to see their point when we're talking about having that if we have a blind spot. So tell us a little bit more about the blind spot.
Yeah, and you can do a simple experiment to see this for yourself. If you put a couple of dots on a piece of paper and close one eye, hold that out a certain distance from you, and just focus on the left dot, moving that at a certain distance from your eye, the right dot in your peripheral vision will disappear. And the reason for that is because you have this blind spot where the nerves, the wires are exiting your eye. So, they claim that this is a defect. No designer would make an eye like this. And by contrast, they say cephalopods, squids and octopuses, have the wires turned the right way around. So why didn't God make the human eye like that? But there are good reasons for this, Our eyes are quite different than those of octopuses.
Right.
We live in different environments, and we have capabilities that they do not have. We have better color vision, for example. And to suit these capabilities, God designed certain things behind the retina, like the choroid, which supplies blood. Also, there's an RPE, the retinal pigment epithelium, and this helps to get rid of the toxic waste that's produced by the processes in our eyes, and it allows us to recover from flashes of bright light very quickly. If you turn the eye the other direction, rewired it, like the evolutionists say it should be wired, you would have to have the choroid and the RPE in front of the eye, which they're opaque, and you couldn't see it all in that case. So there are actually positive, intelligent reasons why our eyes are set up the way they are. But it turns out even this claim about it being a defect is not true because we have these cells in our eyes that actually direct the light through all the wiring without distorting it. They're like fiber optics in our eyes. This was only a discovery made in 2007. They were called the Mueller cells. And so far from being a problem for our sight, our eyes work far better than those of cephalopods. The fiber optics actually work to sharpen the image and help us to perceive color better than these creatures. So, evolutionists are welcome to swap eyes with an octopus if they like, but I don't think they're going to be happy with the final results.
All right, so it seems like superficially one might think that the eye is poorly designed, but it allows us to have more features.
That's right.
So you also mentioned something about a nerve in our neck or something like that. So tell us about the next example.
Okay, this would be, it's called the recurrent laryngeal nerve. Has to do with our larynx, our voice box. Okay, so this nerve goes from our brain to the voice box. Now there is one type of nerve there that makes a direct route straight to the area in the throat where our voice box is located. But the nerve that has evolutionists concerned is one that instead of taking that close direct route, it travels all the way down our neck into our area where our heart is and loops under one of the arteries of our heart and then comes back up to the neck only to reach its final destination. And so they claim that why would a designer not have this nerve just take the shortest route possible and take this, long, unnecessary detour? It seems nonsensical.
That seems to be the logical way to wire it, but that's not the way it is.
That's right. But there are, again, good reasons for this. And those making this claim about poor design are just ignorant of the important reasons that it's set up the way that it is. So, for example, it has nothing to do with an evolutionary past about us evolving from creatures like fish that had a more direct route. Rather, it has to do with the history of how we develop in the womb when we are first embryos and then fetuses. There are developmental constraints on how this nerve has to function early on because we have a very simple beating heart from early in our developmental history. And the nerve is actually supplying the heart with some function at those stages. And so later on, as we continue to develop, our body elongates, the heart descends into the chest area, and the whole nerve complex travels along with it. So that's one of the reasons that God designed it the way he did. But secondly, the evolutionists are also mistaken to think that the only purpose this nerve serves is that final destination in our voice box. It actually branches off in other areas and helps to innervate, that is to control motor functions and also provide sensory information for other parts of our throat, like the esophagus, the trachea, the pharynx, and even parts of our heart, some of the muscles there involved in heart function.
So what seemingly is a designed flaw is actually a designed feature.
That's right. It serves multiple purposes. It's not merely doing one thing. And if you're only considering the one function that it has, then the other parts seem unnecessary, but they all work together to do what God designed them to do.
I hope you're enjoying the episode thus far. As you can imagine, episodes like this require a lot of resources, time, and hard work behind the scenes. We're committed to getting this message out and bringing you more of the talk show, but we can't do it alone. Every contribution, big or small, helps us handle production costs and continue making more content. To help chip in, use the link below or the on-screen option. We're grateful to all of the financial supporters that make Creation Ministries International possible.
Another criticism is that we have really too many bones in our wrists and in our ankles, that they're really unnecessary and useless. So what do you say about these useless bones?
Well, right. This is another common claim. Nathan Lentz, for example, in his book called Human Errors, highlights this one. And he actually has some surprising claims there where he says it's just like a pile of rocks, all these little tiny bones in our wrists, and same thing in our ankles. He said maybe overall, collectively, they serve a purpose, but you don't need all the individual specific bones. In fact, it would be better if we just fused these together and had one single bone. But actually, physiologists and anatomists, they understand that those bones are important. In fact, an engineer, Stuart Burgess, who has won awards for, he's designed bicycles that have competed in the Olympics and won races. When he analyzed the human wrist and ankle structures, he says this is one of the most incredible features of the human body or any, design that he's ever encountered. And so Nathan Lentz is simply ignorant about the important functions that each one of these bones has. Each individual bone is important. Because if you think about the purposes of our joints, the wrists and ankles, they have to do a lot of functions that kind of compete with each other, like provide strength on the one hand, but then be highly flexible on the other. and our ankles support the weight of our bodies and things that we can carry. And so the reason you have individual bones there is because they have ligaments in between them that serve as like a shock absorber, much like you'd have on a bridge or a parking garage, that you don't just have big concrete slabs and design the entire bridge out of that, a firm, rigid structure. You rather want little, flexible parts that when the wind comes, it's going to like sway just a little bit. And that's the way our feet and our wrists are, that the bones move with respect to each other slightly, not a lot, but that gives us added flexibility and strength and able to deal with tension
the stress
forces.
Of it.
That's right.
Right.
They're also housing like nerves that pass through our wrists, to control our hands. So Stuart Burgess, in some of his lectures and papers on these subjects, he absolutely demolishes the claims of Nathan Lentz and shows how ingenious these parts of our bodies are.
So you mentioned Stuart Burgess. It makes me think about how he and other engineers might use biomimicry.
Yeah, that's right. This is a whole field where, human designers are imitating nature's designs, which is really the product of the master designer. And we're still learning so much from the things that God made and realizing how we can improve our, structural designs and so forth. Tiny bumps on a whale's flipper, for example. You might not have thought that was the most efficient way to be aerodynamic, and yet we've implemented that feature on various fans of blades and airplane wings and things like that. This is an incredible field of study that shows how God is responsible for nature because we keep imitating him, and we're still, dwarfed by the technology that nature exhibits.
All right, speaking of seemingly useless or misunderstood features or body parts, that begs the question about our appendix. So how would you address the critics that say that's really just leftovers from our evolutionary past?
Mm-hmm. Right. So the appendix is one of many things, body parts, that evolutionists have historically called vestigial organs, right? A vestige being like a remnant or a trace of something that once existed. And the idea is that body part, though it doesn't do anything in humans today, we have it because we inherited it from our animal ancestors, and it may have performed a more important function back in the distant evolutionary past. But that's just a claim made out of ignorance. 100 years ago, they were saying there were like hundreds of vestigial body parts that we have, but we have since found functions for essentially every one of those, and that includes the human appendix. So what this is it's a little worm-like tube that comes off of our intestines, our colon, our large intestine, and we know that it contains lymphatic tissue. And so even if we don't fully understand what role it plays in fighting diseases, it does seem to have some role in, our immune system. It's very much like our tonsils, which they also thought was a vestigial organ.
Right.
That's kind of a first line of defense as we're swallowing food, and then the appendix has a role later on. But also, scientists today say that the appendix it has a function as a bacterial safe house. And what that means is we have a lot of bacteria in our gut, and the purpose of those is to help aid in digestion. But when we get certain types of illnesses, we expel the bad bacteria out of our gut, but it takes good and bad out together.
Right.
And so to replenish those good bacteria, it's kind of like a little separate compartment, the appendix is, right, that has some of these extra good bacteria there, and they can more quickly repopulate the gut and restore us to health more speedily than if we had not had such an appendix. But my favorite thing to point out with the appendix is there was an insightful paper in the secular scientific literature explaining how in the evolutionary scheme of things, there's the way the appendix is distributed among different types of animals, that evolutionists cannot claim the appendix evolved one time and then was handed down through ancestry to all these different types of living things. Rather, they claim that the appendix evolved over and over again on separate branches of the evolutionary tree just by pure coincidence.
That's an interesting thought that 18 or so, something,
That's
multiple
right.
times
Yeah.
that it did that.
We have an article on our website called "The Appendix Shrieks Creation" that points out, this the fact of the matter here, and it shows how I don't believe the evolutionary story, but if they believe the appendix evolved again and again and again, then clearly, even from their point of view, it must have a function.
Right, so how about our tailbone? Isn't that just a remnant of our evolutionary past?
Well, this is another claim that is surprisingly common even to this day. It features in the book by Nathan Lentz. And back in 2017, I visited the American Museum of Natural History in New York. World-class museum, right? And yet I was shocked to find this sign about the human tailbone, also known as the coccyx, which they say is 3 to 5 vertebrae fused together at the base of our spine, right? It's this little kind of upside down triangular bone beneath a sacrum at the back of our pelvis. But what the sign says is the tailbone serves no purpose, except that it points to our evolutionary history, that we supposedly descended from animals that had tails at one time. But I think that claim is undercut by anybody with expertise in this field of anatomy, physiology. They'll tell you that the tailbone serves as an anchor point for a variety of muscles and ligaments and tendons in our body. And those muscles and things do themselves have important functions. Now, that's not to say that the tailbone is essential to our bodies, right? We can live without it. Sometimes people fall and break their tailbones, and in certain cases, they'll have to have them removed. And so they can live without it, but the rest of our body has to make up the difference, right? But we know that nevertheless, it is serving important functions, like the muscles that attach there help to support our internal organs. They form like a bowl-shaped structure called our pelvic diaphragm, and they hold in the organs of our body and help to give them support. There are other functions that those muscles are used for as well. Like in women, they use them for giving birth, and in males and females, we use them daily. Certain functions that we all perform, right? I don't have to go into detail there. But it serves as an anchor for one thing, but also it helps to bear our weight when we're seated and when we're lying down. So we have 2 bones in the front of our pelvis, and the tailbone is like a third leg of a tripod in the back. And so the more we recline, the more it bears our weight.
So almost like a kickstand for a bicycle, kind of helps support.
Yeah, or like a 3-legged stool, something like that, So yeah, it's just fallacious to claim that this body part serves no purpose. There is a good reason why God designed the body the way that he did.
So if God did indeed design our body the way that it seems that he has, what does that mean for us? What is the takeaway that you want people to know about how God has wonderfully designed our bodies?
Yeah, I think it's clear, as we mentioned early on, that most people recognize design in nature. These few supposed exceptions to the rule don't disprove the general truth that our bodies are wonderfully and masterfully designed. As the psalmist says, we're fearfully and wonderfully made. But even these claims about poor design, they're getting in the way of doing good science, claiming that our body parts have no function or work poorly, and interfering with researching why God did things this way. But once we recognize the truth that there are excellent reasons behind why our body parts are designed the way they are, then it shows that we do have a creator. And we should, get to know who that creator is, given that he's made all of us for a purpose. And that's what the Bible goes on to reveal, is the purpose behind why God designed us the way that he has.
All right, speaking of design, you actually have, by design, one of our resources speaking to this topic. So can you tell us some more about it?
Absolutely. This is an excellent book, a new edition written by our staff scientist, Dr. Jonathan Sarfati. And you can see in this new edition, it's got these full color, beautiful pictures illustrating God's marvelous handiwork in the things that he made. And so he walks through like example after example of living things that showcase complex features, catapults, and how birds accomplish flight, and the pulley system and their lung design, and colors, how different types of colors, iridescent colors and pigmented colors are produced. And just again, it's human engineers learning from the wonders that God built into nature.
And we do have a 25% discount in the description. So that's fantastic, Keaton. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure.